In this second cycle of our School of Christianity, we must bind to that which we have already considered and we have tried to put into practice. The title of the book of the School of Christianity is The Truth of Love. We are accustomed to hear and talk of joy and the joy of love. But even if it does not seem at first sight, the first joy of man is the joy of truth. We insist on the fact that to be a true joy of love, love must be true, must be in truth. We can express this thought with a slogan. It is not true that love is God, but it is true that God is love. If we say that love is God, as many people say, we fall into a swamp without noticing it. But if we say that God is love, we need contemplation of this mystery. I would like to reiterate this mystery with some words that Pope Benedict XVI used on June 7th, 2009, on the Feast of the Trinity, because he was particularly expressive, and it made it clear for us that the truth of blind faith binds us to all reality. He said, "Today we contemplate the most holy Trinity as Jesus introduced us. He revealed to us that God is love. Three people who are one God, because the Father is love, the Son is love, the Spirit is love. God is holy and only love, the purest love, infinite and eternal. He does not live in splendid solitude, but rather is an inexhaustible source of life that is ceaselessly given and communicated. To a certain extent, we can perceive, observing both the macro-universe, our Earth, the planets, the stars, the galaxies, and both the micro-universe, cells, atoms, elementary particles. And everything that exists is in a certain sense imprinted with the name of the Blessed Trinity. Because the whole being up to the last particle in being in relation and thus reveals God relation, shine lastly the Creator love. All things derived from love, aspire to love, and move impelled by love, though naturally with varying degrees of awareness and freedom. The strongest proof that we are made in the image of the Trinity is this. Only love alone makes us happy, because we live in a relationship and we live to love and to be loved. Using an analogy from biology, we would say that the human being bears in his genome from the profound mark of the Trinity, of God who is love. When we speak of God and of the divine people, rightly so, we consider the person as something complete in itself. But then we realize that God, love, tells us that the person is the whole relationship of love, is in the entire gift of love, fulfills himself the more he opens and gives himself. When we hear this, there arises a question.
Per le persone che, diciamo, sono capaci di almeno un po' di serietà nella vita e un po' anche di sofferenza nella vita, si pone
People ask,
interrogativo. Se
if all swear that love is the most important thing,
è la cosa più importante,
if we all say
di voler
you
amare,
want to love,
che l'amore
that love has all the rights, so as to be prepared to accept any experience that bears the name of love,
qualunque comportamento e qualunque esperienza porti il cosiddetto nome di amore, se questo
if this is true,
come mai
then how come there is so much suffering? How come there are so many tragedies?
tante tragedie? Se
If it is true
tutto ciò che viene chiamato amore, sia quando si parla sia quando si agisce,
if everything is love, if this is really true,
la verità, se fosse vero, il mondo
the world should be full of happiness and beauty and joy.
è pieno di gioia, pieno di contentezza. Ed è proprio la sofferenza, la tristezza,
It's sad that everyone yells, love, love.
amore grida tutto il mondo, amore, amore, ogni cosa clama, sembra una poesia di Alcune Datori, va bene? Se tutti
How come the world is not full of happiness?
di volere amare chiamano amore la propria esperienza, se questo è vero, come mai il mondo non è pieno di felicità? Credo se
This is also a question that St. Augustine was asking.
dovremmo essere così felici. Allora c'è
There is a fact.
che noi
We speak of love,
che intuiamo che l'amore
we perceive that love must give happiness,
che
and all of this is just
perché il discorso su Dio amore
because we are loved.
significa che tutti siamo amati, che tutto ciò che esiste, tutti coloro che esistono sono stati.
We were created for love.
Il testo proprio teologico latino dice siamo stati creati ex amore
We were created from the womb of the love of God,
e veniamo mantenuti
and we are kept in the love as if God would extract continuously as a mother from the womb of his love. If this is true, we must admit that something has happened,
cosa è accaduto, che la
that love was wounded.
teologia
There is the original sin,
che cosa è accaduto nella
an original tearing.
parla di peccato originale, parla di un'originale lacerazione
An original suspicion of man toward God.
verso Dio, di una originale tentazione, però
But there is affirmation. We are loved. We are loved to the point that the Son of God, seeing our condition,
vedendoci il Padre, il suo Figlio, vedendoci
had decided to come among us,
la spesso tragica Ecclesial, ha deciso di
to become man,
farsi uomo
to incarnate
solo, ma di attraversare
and cross the whole of our human condition. You know, St. Paul arrives to say an expression that even gives us fear when he said, Christ did not commit sin, but for love of us, he became sin. When John the Baptist called Jesus the Lamb of God who takes upon himself the sins of the world, and the Son of God who came to us in love and to explain to us the love and to make us capable of true love, first has crossed all history, all contradictions, our darkness, our weights, our dramas, our lives on love. He left himself reduced to an end on the cross.
all'estremo. Gesù crocifisso. Ricordate quel che vi dicevo l'altra volta.
An ancient medieval author said, if you have never been enamored by, or fallen in love by crucified Christ, it means that in reality, you have never fallen in love with anything. Because our gaze to the crucified Jesus means a look to the love that makes its whole journey to give life. Jesus said, no one has greater love than the one who gives his life for the people who he loves. He has given to each one of us individually. For some mystics, Jesus says, I, life, I would have given for you, for everyone. When we are witnessing this revelation of love, we know that as Christians, if we really want to love with truth and have a message of truth to the world, because the world is loved by God, we must look to the person of Jesus and learn what it means to love. So, here in this scene we have arrived to the moment in which Jesus defines himself. We believe there is in the Gospel of John in which there is a series of statements. I am the light, I am the life, I am the truth, I am the vine, I am the way. But the most important one that we will discuss tonight is, I am the living bread, the bread of life. So let's try to reconstruct the moment of the scene in which Jesus explained to be the bread of life. It was a long day. Jesus, as usual, had preached. That day, an immense crowd, the Gospel speaks of nearly 4,000 people, had followed him to listen to him. These simple people had made an experience that St. John of the Cross describes. The heart of man is never satisfied with less than God. We know what hunger is. And when we are hungry, we also instantly cling for a piece of bread. But then we understand that there is so much hunger for happiness, hunger for beauty, hunger for love, hunger for truth. The people who were following Jesus, even forgetting to eat, were discovering that the human heart is never satisfied with less than God. This we must learn to tell ourselves and communicate ourselves reciprocally, even with those who are far away. St. John of the Cross has also another expression which, in some respects, is even more interesting. Caves of the soul do not fill up with less than the infinite. These caves of the soul, even psychologists speak about. And St. John said that these caves of the soul do not fill up with less than the infinite. This could do well for people who not only have normal caves of the soul, but whose souls are even more collapsed, have more wounds, are more ill. These people who have depression, illness, fears,
mancanza di voglia di vivere, paura. Ti sta succedendo di sperimentare. E hai fame.
express that you are hungry for something infinite. Those people were having a bit of this experience.
Però la fame prima, quella
But even physical hunger makes itself felt anywhere.
poi si fa sentire comunque.
So returning to the gospel,
Il Vangelo a sera
it said that
Gesù stesso disse ai
in the evening the disciples said to Jesus,
meglio i discepoli dissero a Gesù, Signore,
Lord, leave them. Now it is late. If we go on like this, they will no longer find anything to eat in their towns, in the shops. And Jesus replies, feed them all. The disciples look at him and tell him, Lord, we have 200 money's worth of loaves,
sappiamo sempre dal Vangelo, era
but are they going to be enough to give all to eat?
la paga di 200 giornate di lavoro, non basterebbero per dar da mangiare a tutti. E poi
And then comes a disciple and says,
che aveva capito come era fatto Gesù, gli dice, Signore,
but Lord, there is a boy who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish.
e 2 pesci. E Gesù
And Jesus says, tell everyone to sit down.
di sedersi. C'era grande
Everyone sits in clusters on the ground.
sede, una gruppetta.
And the disciples begin to distribute the bread. And what happens is the miracle of the bread that multiplies.
Ho sentito parlare, il miracolo del pane che si moltiplica.
In the end, everyone is satisfied.
Si raccolgono delle
They collect baskets of bread.
e poi ognuno torna.
They return home. The day after, the people think about what has happened.
Addirittura dice il Vangelo, andarono a
And even the gospel says that the people went to fetch him because they wanted to make him king. Always man is ready to follow those who give him bread. Jesus makes this discourse of incredible beauty.
guardate che il discorso di Gesù è di una bellezza incredibile, il capitolo
In the 6th chapter of the Gospel of St. John.
Giovanni. Questa scuola che dovete fare io,
Try to read it carefully because it is a whole series of statements.
perché è tutta una serie di affermazioni. Ve ne
I will read you some of them.
il Padre mio, Lui vi darà il pane del cielo, quello vero. E allora la gente subito, Signore, dacci sempre questo pane. Come la
So,
Samaritana
I will read.
quando l'acqua viva diceva, Signore, dammi di quest'acqua. E così è Gesù, io sono il pane della vita.
So they say to him, what sign do you execute because we see you and believe you?
Io sono
What work do you do?
questo e
Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat.
io sono il pane vivo disceso dal cielo.
Jesus answers and says unto them, truthfully, truthfully, I say to you, it is not Moses who gave you bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you true bread from heaven. In fact, the bread of God is which cometh down from heaven and gives life to the world.
La mia carne e beve il mio sangue ha la vita eterna. Io nel
Then he said, Lord, give us this bread always. Jesus answered and said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will not thirst, ever.
immedesimazione totale. Ecco, Gesù dice queste parole. Ed ecco quello che accade.
So the Jews strove heartily among them and said, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus says unto them, truthfully, truthfully, I say unto you, if you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you.
Dice ai suoi discepoli, ve ne volete andare anche voi?
He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will rise him up on the last day. This happens that Jesus will be abandoned by all if they go and say, what a difficult speech. How can you eat flesh? They did not understand. The story of Jesus continues. It was touched by the decisive point, stay with Christ or leave.
Stare con Cristo
The moment arrives that even the disciples that love him, that were his neighbors, that Jesus worked with and to whom Jesus had already answered the heart, are about to leave. It is the Last Supper. The disciples are about to go away. Then they see him lashed, then mocked, then humiliated, and nailed to the cross, exposed naked to the contempt of the world. When it is about to happen, Jesus plays this in advance. He took bread, he broke it, he said, "Take it and eat it, this is my body. Take it and drink it, this is my blood." Here the verb consume is used, which is terrible. It speaks to consume objects, relationship, life. In Sicily, it is even used to say, kill a person. There is only one case when the verb consume is good. It is when we are at the table and consume amicably with desire. With desire the food that has been prepared, starting with the bread. Jesus says, "You are consuming my life, but I chose the significance of this destruction." Is there a way with which consume and nourish oneself? The bread. Jesus performs the miracle and realizes the truth of love. Let me explain why. When a person loves, sooner or later, the thing that they want most is to make a gift to the beloved person. The value of the gift is not in the richness of the gift. If a person were to give an expensive gift because he wants to seduce us or wants us to fill our eyes and capture us, that there is no love, that gift would make us disgusted. But if a person gives us one thing, humble and small, but we understand that he gives it to us with love, then that which is small and humble becomes expensive. We hold there in part, and we do not want anyone to touch it or despise it or throw it away. Man knows, of course, that love tries to give something, but there is always that last question that a poet expresses so well. What sadness, my love, to get a gift and not be able to be myself the gift that I give you. In the gift, one says, I give you this because I cannot give you myself, but I would like to give you myself. Here is what the miracle of Jesus. He was the Son of God. He was not only one who loved, but love made into person. To be the gift he has invented the miracle. I asked myself, when did he think of this? Probably the day when he said, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit, because it becomes bread. He had said that, speaking of himself. Saint Teresa of Avila, when she explained the Eucharist, bound at the moment in which Jesus has taught us to pray, give us our daily bread. Intended for all bread, from what we eat at home to the Eucharist. St. Teresa explained it so. Jesus had said to pray, saying, "It is made your will on heaven as it is in heaven. It has made your will on earth as it is in heaven." Then he stopped and thought, "What did I do? Poor man, how can I do on earth the will as it is done in heaven? They are so fragile." So in his logic, he concluded, I have to stay with them. Thus he continued, "Give us this day our daily bread." So, in this is that Eucharistic miracle. One thing that makes the heart beat. I have noticed it perhaps for the first time, and I will explain to you how, because I think it was a grace of God. Jesus said, "Do this in memory of me." And this is what the priest always repeats. It is to realize that this does not mean this little poor gesture. But everything that the gesture involves, and the gesture is whole, complete. Take, eat, do this. St. Paul would say, if we eat all the same bread, one bread, then we are one body. If I would think of the consecration as a gesture that concerns me and Jesus, and just that perhaps I would not consecrate either. This gesture is a gesture that involves all the people to whom the same bread is intended. Let me explain. In that sense, I think that the Lord has made a grace. I had to do a meditation for the students in Sicily. But before I received a call, and they told me, "Listen, Father Antonio, Margherita, probably she has arrived at the end. Margherita was hospitalized today. She's a 20-year-old girl who has suffered from the moment of her birth, one illness after another, and now her tiny body is destroyed. It is in bed. The family desires to make the sacraments. Do you want to bring them to her?" So I went to her house. I saw this good and sweet young woman. She recognized me. She attempted to smile and to move herself. Then I asked her if she wanted the oil of the infirm, and I realized that all the times that I was making a sign of the cross, she tried to laboriously raise her arm unsuccessfully. almost to accompany the gesture.
Poi alla fine ho detto Margherita, adesso io ti do
At the end I said, Margherita, now I give you Jesus. I had brought a host. I had taken a little piece and put it on her tongue. And I remained with the rest of the host in my hand. I divided it into 2 parts. I gave a part to her father and to her mother. Do you understand? I had the evidence that the gesture must be complete, whole. The person responsible for the community who had accompanied me told me, you see, I am responsible for the community. But in reality, the one responsible for the community is this family, the father and the mother. That despite a situation that has lasted for 20 years and requires continuous assistance each day and night, they live with the fullness of the life of the community. They are always there. When I came out, the father accompanied me because he had to help students with the singing. Sometimes for us it is so easy to make excuses for not going to a meeting. I have so many things to do. And yet that responsible person in Sicily said, I am always here. And looking at that tiny body and thinking of the words, I will rise up on the last day. And I thought, who knows how we will become beautiful on the day of the resurrection. I am not a sentimental person. But there are moments in which God takes you and forces you to see the words that you are accustomed to saying. So, we can continue. So this is the story of the early Christians. Devoted themselves to the Word of God, to the breaking of bread, and were of one heart and one soul. They were putting together even their money. The first Christian power of the Eucharist, they knew what was a wedding. Think of what the text of St. Paul says. Husbands, love your wives as Christ has given himself, and the wife respects the body of her husband. At the time of the early Christians, everything was lawful and everything was allowed. Christians have dictated the single family, indissoluble, the equal dignity of women, and the power of the Eucharist. Marriage is the love pushed up to the gift of the body. Jesus had done it in the Eucharist. Who that was receiving the Eucharist was hearing, do this. He understood that the first thing to do was that with the family. Thus the Son of God entered into communion with the whole human nature. Remember the text that we say often of John Paul II, who says, by his incarnation, the Son of God has united himself in some fashion with every man. all men. Here, so this is of man in all its truth and full dimension. This is not abstract man, but real, of man, concrete, historical. We Christians believe the whole history of Jesus who makes himself man. So we have many problems. We do not know what to do. But if a Christian believes in Jesus who in becoming man unites himself with each man and every man and makes a piece of bread that anyone can expect and even profane should not come from the mouth, from the heart, from the eyes, no contempt for no man, because every man has been touched by the incarnation of Christ and from the Eucharist. I should like to conclude by saying, Jesus who came down from heaven did not depart. He remained. There is a place where he is. I will ask you a question. When in your life do you have a serious appointment, as did the saints? The first thing they did was going before the Eucharist and talking about it with Jesus. St. Thomas wrote a difficult book, then put it on the altar and said, "Jesus, what do you think? Are you happy?" Jesus answered him, "You have done well, Thomas. You wrote well. What do you want?" "Nothing other than Lord." And Father Pia Marta, when he was remaining without bread for the boys, went to church and he said, "Jesus, we no longer have bread." And he had assumed that Jesus answered. M.E.C said, "If Jesus is made bread, we have only one problem. Become bread like him." Okay, as it's getting late, I want to say some little prepared text. This one, the day after Monday 24th, March 1980, in the afternoon. Romeo celebrates Mass in the chapel of the little hospital, the Hospital of Divine Providence for the terminally ill with cancer. In the homily comment on the gospel of the grain of wheat that fell to the ground must die in order to bear fruit. Then applies it to the Eucharist, which is to offer, he says, "In this moment the host of wheat is converted into the body of the Lord offered for the redemption of the world. And the wine in this cup is transformed into blood, price of salvation. That his body sacrificed and this body sacrificed for men give us courage to give our body and our blood together with Jesus to give fruits of justice and peace to our people. Let us unite then deeply in faith and hope in this moment of prayer." And then from the end of a church, we hear a shot. The faithful see their archbishop fall to the side of the altar, hit in the chest with a bullet, falling with the hands still clinging to the corporal. Romeo dragged his body over the wine in the host, and he would have consecrated, and all of it is covered in his blood. That was said by Oscar Romero. And I will give you this last one. A few months before dying, Bishop Shin was interviewed for national television, and he was asked, "Who has inspired you? Perhaps one of the popes?" The bishop replied that his greatest source of inspiration was not a pope, a cardinal, or another bishop, and not even a priest or religious sister, but an 11-year-old Chinese girl. He explained that when the communists took power in China, they had arrested a priest in his rectory near the church. The priest observed frightened from the window while the communists were invading the sacred building and on their way toward the altar. Full of hatred, profaned the tabernacle and took the pyx and threw it to the ground, spreading everywhere the consecrated host. It was a period of persecution, and the priest knew exactly how many hosts there were in the chalice, 32. When the communists retreated, perhaps they had not seen or not paid attention to a little girl who, praying in the rear part of the church, had seen everything. In the evening, the small girl returned and, circumventing the guard post in the rectory, went to the church, where she made a holy hour of prayer, an act of love, to repair it for the act of hatred. After her holy hour, she approached the altar. She knelt down and, bowing forward with her tongue, she received Jesus in Holy Communion. The small one continued to return every evening, making the holy hour and taking the Eucharist Jesus on her tongue. When the bishop listened to that story, he was so inspired, so to promise God he would make an hour of prayer before Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament every day for the rest of his life. I should like to conclude by saying, in this church every Sunday, at the end of Vespers Mass, we make 3/4 of an hour of adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Some of you are present. We want to try to mature on this truth. Jesus is there. Jesus is the Eucharist. Young people, families who can, why not stay a little before Jesus, the Eucharist, once a week? We propose this to all. Proposing this to all means we have many appointments, but to be Christian until the end, to be M.E.C. We live an appointment with him